So welcome again, everyone. My name is Anna or Anuki Mosiashvili. A bit about myself. I'm coming from Georgia, as Simon already mentioned. I have been a fellow in 2023 cohort. Please keep an eye to this fellowship opportunity. It was a wonderful support indeed to implement my project. And we will talk about the results of the project, and the webinar is also kind of about further disseminating what we researched in Georgia and also amplifying the results of our project in the whole region, in Eastern Partnership region. I hold master's degree in international human rights law. I worked on my thesis and I researched human rights-based approach to climate change and disaster-induced internal displacement. Mariam will talk about eco-migrant women. That's how we call in Georgian the people who have been forcibly displaced because of disasters. But my thesis was also on that topic, so that gives a bit of background of what I have done in terms of research. I'm a co-author of the gender analysis of Georgia's climate change and disaster risk management and reduction legal and policy framework. We will talk about this briefly in a second. And I have been also the co-author of the Eco-Migrant Women for Environmental Justice. All of these projects have been funded and supported by Women's Fund in Georgia. Also, thanks to them. And I was one of the organizers of the Eastern Partnership Climate Leadership School, which happened last August, together with other fellows from other countries in the region. And currently I work as a research and program officer at the European Partnership for Democracy. So moving on also briefly about what we are going to talk about in this 1 hour, and probably a bit more if there are more questions. So we will start by discussing and presenting the document, this policy review document that we worked on as part of my fellowship project last year. So basically it's the gender analysis of climate change and disaster management policies in Georgia through, of course, gender lens. And then we also worked on the policy recommendations, and I will briefly present that. Then we will talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, natural disasters versus disasters, this terminological dilemma that still exists nowadays. And then understanding risk, so how the risk is created and then calculated, gender and vulnerability in connection to understanding risk, intersectionality, and then Mariam will take it over to talk about her research project specifically focusing on eco-migrant women in Georgia. So the first part of the webinar is more of a kind of like theoretical understanding of the basic concepts and topics. I understand that there might be different levels of expertise and expert experience among participants. So some things might be too basic for some people, but I think it's still important to kind of like create common understanding of some of the important concepts when we talk about climate change and the gender nexus. So starting from this report that I mentioned, this was developed as part of my fellowship project last year. Mariam is also co-author and co-researcher together with the third researcher also coming from Georgia. You can scan the QR code and access this document available in English, but it's also available in Georgian for those who want to read in Georgian, obviously. So what we did, and not going to go into details of this whole document, of course, you can always download and have a look, and please reach out to me if you have any additional questions, but also just to explain kind of the methodology that we used, because it might be interesting for colleagues and activists and researchers in other countries in our region to carry out similar research. So what we did basically, we of course also started by explaining and introducing the key concepts related to climate change, disasters, what is a disaster management, climate change policies, and so on. And then we reviewed all the climate change related policies in Georgia and also the disaster risk management and reduction policies. And then we looked at these documents through gender perspective. So meaning that, does this document reflect anything about gender, and not specifically on women or certain groups, but in general, if it's gender sensitive at all. Some of the documents turned out to be quite gender sensitive. There's several mentions of gender. the specific needs of the groups and so on. But in general, also what we found out is that a lot of documents are quite gender blind. That's how we call it. So there is no mention of gender at all. There is no gender lens applied to these documents. So based on the analysis of the whole framework of the policies on climate change and disaster management risk reduction, we came out with several policy recommendations. And the policy recommendations, of course, target the governmental institutions who are responsible to manage all of this. And not only the governmental institutions, but also the civil society actors, because of course, civil society can always advocate for certain topics, and these policy recommendations could potentially help to shape the advocacy campaigns. Speaking of that, of course, what is written on the pages and on the papers is not always enough, because right now, as we speak, unfortunately, there is a disaster happening in Georgia, in west part of Georgia. We have experienced heavy snow, and several people unfortunately died in the region of Guria because of several reasons. But the thing is that the country and the government is not ready to, first of all, to reduce the risks of disasters, and then to be prepared to the disasters, potential disasters, and then to respond to the disasters. So we have been receiving news that even pregnant women are stuck into houses without electricity and without any road to access these houses, and so on. We will talk about how women can be more affected by the effects of climate change and disasters in the second part. I just wanted to mention now that even as we speak, the problem is there, and I think that the document that we worked on, the report, is quite useful for anyone who is willing to work on disaster risk management and reduction policies. So yes, you can access the report via QR code, but also please put any question if you have in the chat box, and then we will try to respond to these questions. So diving into the more kind of theoretical part of this webinar, I wanted to briefly talk about the key concepts. And one of the key concepts is that we already know, and it has been concluded, that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. And what does it exactly mean? How climate change multiplies the threat? Of course, the negative effects of climate change are visible in almost all parts of our life. And the basis of this is that whatever problems we had in the society, it will be exacerbated. It will become even more because of climate change, because of these unusual situations that climate change can create, such as, for example, hazards, natural hazards that have been happening but will happen even more. And that's why it's called threat multipliers, because these disasters will become more frequent. I also wanted to make this interaction a bit more engaging, so I have prepared Mentimeter questions. Okay, so the first question, what do we mean by a disaster? Okay, we're receiving a few ideas already. Something that we can prevent or reduce the damage if we prepare well. Very well said. However, like, what do you think? What is disaster? What is disastrous about these events that can happen? Something really, really bad, usually costing people's lives. Indeed, something really bad that can cost not only people's lives, but also livelihood, environment, and lots of, in general, our living environment, right? Something that threatens the planet or human beings. The impact on human lives, the negative impacts, right? Disastrous effect. Okay. Environmental act that destroys people's life. Sometimes preventable, indeed. Sudden large-scale damage. All right, very interesting entries. You can keep sending this. Might be interesting also to have sort of like overview of how we what are the associations related to disasters. But moving on to the next question. So the question is, which term is more common in your country, natural disasters or natural hazards? All right. Natural disasters, already two answers, 3, 4, wow, 7. I see that 7 people are mainly engaging. Okay, 8. Natural hazards. I wonder which country is this? 9. Okay, let's give 20 more seconds. Indeed. So the question is, but they refer to different phenomenon. However, the terminology that is common in countries does not really acknowledge that difference. So that's why I brought this question up. What is more common in your countries? All right, so I think it's pretty clear that natural disasters are more common in the countries of those who are attending to this webinar. Let me bring back my main presentation. All right, indeed. So the natural disasters as a terminology have been quite common even in our country. This is the most common terminology in other countries, and even in literature, in research, you would even now until now you would come across the terminology natural disasters, which is not correct because natural disasters do not exist while natural hazards do, right? And we had a question in the chat box that they refer to different phenomena, and they do refer to different phenomena. However, natural disasters as such do not exist. I don't know if you could share any reactions in the chat box. I think it would be interesting if you agree with this statement that the natural disasters do not exist. Feel free to continue writing in the chat box, and we will have a minute to also read out if you have any ideas. So, of course, terminology matters because all of this is connected to the responsibility of the state and the government, who is the one who should respond to the threats, who should minimize the risk, who should prevent the possible potential disaster. A lot of you mentioned something that can be preventable, right? Sometimes, indeed, it can be preventable if the society is well prepared, if the government institutions and if the authorities are well prepared to deal with the risk and also to reduce the risk and then to deal with the consequences. So basically, hazards are natural events occurring more or less frequently. I mean, we have, for example, excessive snow is a hazard, right? But whether it becomes disastrous or not, it depends how well the authorities, how prepared the authorities are. For example, taking this case of Guria, one of the regions in Georgia, the one that I just mentioned at the beginning of webinar, there is excessive snow. It happens. It's a natural hazard that a lot of snow may come. But if there are no equipment, if there is no equipment, if no one notified the population that there might be excessive snow, heavy snow, if there are no kind of like support lines who can immediately react on this hazard, then it may become disastrous. And in our case, it already became disastrous because several people lost their houses, several people lost their lives. There are people stuck, women, elderly, and children at home without any access to outside world. There is no electricity, there is no connection. They don't have mobile phones to even connect with their relatives because the batteries are out because of lack of electricity. So basically, what we want to say that when we continue using the terminology of natural disasters, we anyhow diminish the responsibility of the state and authorities. Because it also happened, Georgia is located in an interesting geographical region where these natural hazards happen. it's a mountainous region, it's a mountainous country, there will be hazards, right? And last year, for example, in one of the regions, a landslide happened and 22 people died there. And some of the officials who went to the place, they said it was a disaster, it was something unavoidable, we couldn't have done anything. And that's how they avoided the responsibility. While, of course, nowadays it is possible to have the forecast, weather forecast. For example, the heavy snow is easily, we could easily know that there would be heavy snow, right? 10 days ago. And the preparations could have started like 10 days ago. But because the natural disasters terminology also kind of reinforces this lack of responsibility and accountability of the government and state institutions, it is very important to use the correct methodology. And that's what we wanted to do, first of all, to kind of create the common understanding and ground for these topics, because that also links to the main concept, key concept of vulnerability, which is crucial in terms of understanding how gender, climate change, and disasters are interconnected. And now I also wanted to talk about a bit about understanding vulnerability. So the phenomenon of disaster should be understood as a natural hazard plus vulnerability. For example, going back to this case of Guria, where we have heavy snow, a lot of houses are just not good enough to handle 2 meters of snow. They don't have good support walls, they're not renovated and so on. They are not built in a way to be resilient to this hazards. So a lot of houses also got demolished. Taking also the example of also again in the region, Turkey, when the earthquake happened, a lot of houses could not handle, they were not resilient, they could not stand still during the earthquake because they were built with poor, cheap materials. So that also has to do something with vulnerability, right? How vulnerability is created is exactly kind of compilation of all these factors. And I wanted to talk about the correlation between vulnerability, the natural hazards that we already talked about, exposure, which is also the key element, and all of this, how all of this create the risk. So how do we measure risk? What's the risk, right? Because we are all at risk one way or another, but sometimes we have lesser risk, we have sometimes higher risk. And how do we measure this is kind of like intercorrelation of three main factors. So natural hazards we already explained, for example, hurricanes, tornadoes, landslides, heavy snow, heavy rain, a lot of other things, right? Earthquakes. These are natural hazards. But there are, of course, some underlying factors that also can change the dynamics of the hazards, for example, timing and duration, intensity, and so on. Then we look at the vulnerability, right? What kind of vulnerabilities we have in the society. For example, it can be physical capacities. There can be people with certain disabilities. There can be also, for example, the housing that is not resilient enough and so on. And then there are some other underlying factors such as health, education, socioeconomic and political factors, can be gender there as well. And we will talk about gender indeed in the next slides. And then exposure. For example, if the group of people who were right next to the area where the landslide happened, of course, they were exposed to the higher risk than someone who was, I don't know, 3 villages farther than the case, right, where the landslide happened. So it, of course, matters how close we are to the hazard, the area of hazard. And then all of this create, the correlation of all of this creates the risk. So the risk can be translated into many different things, and you already mentioned in Mentimeter that can be loss of life, it can be physical damage, economic loss, death, injury, epidemics, and so on. So risk is can be translated in many ways, right? What depends on the type of the damage. This is just another diagram that looks at risk as the correlation of three diagrams. So again, we look at the hazards, the exposure, and then vulnerability. So this is just another example of how we can look at the risk and analyze the risk. Both of these diagrams are quite interesting. But this one has a bit of, the difference there is that we have vulnerability, exposure, and risk together, while the intersection of hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and risk, this is the intersection of three factors. When talking about vulnerability, of course, we need to understand that the people in the society have different vulnerabilities, right? And that this has to do something with existing gender stereotypes that we have in the society. We know that women tend to be more vulnerable to certain situations because of these gender roles, gender stereotypes, and gender barriers that exist in the society. And then we'll talk about some examples to make it more clear. So in general, climate change will be even more dangerous to vulnerable groups, such as not only, we should not only look at this from gender perspective, but in general, right? We have vulnerable groups, and we have groups that don't have as much vulnerabilities as some groups. But of course, women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, and that again amplifies the existing gender inequalities and creates even more barriers for women and girls. Some data that also tells how women have been more affected during these disasters. For example, in Myanmar, as a result of the cyclone Nargis in 2008, 68% of all the fatalities were women. 70% in Indian Ocean 2004 were women, 91%, and that was 14 women for every man. But that's not all. I mean, also to look at other geographies, for example, heat-related deaths in Europe, 56% were women. So we can see this balance between men and women. And even if they survive these disastrous events, the threats for women are higher in the aftermath period. And for example, in 2010, when the Haiti earthquake happened, there were certain armed groups and gangs that they were also targeting women and girls. There have been few cases of rape and so on. Moving on to see all this different vulnerability, we have this approach of intersectionality that I'm sure that some of you are quite familiar with, but I again wanted to explain this as a kind of key concept of how we can understand vulnerability better, right? Intersectionality is an approach that recognizes how individuals hold multiple identities and face unique challenges at the intersections of those identities. For example, of course, I mean, we're all different. We have our own, all of us have our own contexts, all identities, experiences, and so on. And this is kind of also another visual diagram of how certain concepts and certain aspects of our life and certain identities shape us as we are as humans, right? But just to imagine women who have certain disabilities in the times of natural hazard, their vulnerability of course increases, because apart from having vulnerability created just because they're women, we also have certain, for example, disabilities that also hinder their flexibility to respond to the critical catastrophic situations, right? And then there can be other layers as well. So all these layers are connected to the degree of vulnerability. And that's why intersectionality is very, very important when analyzing vulnerability and the risk. We always need to look at these identities, because one solution cannot be good for all the groups, right? And what we noticed is that when we did this climate change and disaster risk management framework analysis through gender perspectives, intersectionality was missing in almost all the documents. There were a few documents that kind of, for example, also mentioned pregnant women, so kind of, adding another layer to the situation, or disabled disabilities, but that was it. There was no understanding of intersectionality that much in the documents, while it's very critical to look at the situations from this intersectional perspective. So, of course, intersectionality is not only related to disaster management or climate change, but this is a tool that helps us to understand the specific needs and challenges of certain groups in the society. And I mean, this is a bit about how intersectional feminism was born, and a bit of like kind of historical background, but we are not going to go into these details considering that we don't have much time. But I also wanted to briefly talk about the specific challenges that are related to women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, because these are also specific challenges that are often connected and associated with women. For example, limited access to health services when the disaster is happening and in the aftermath of the disaster, including the pre and postnatal care, abortion, and other services. There are increased incidences of gender-based violence, for example, even during COVID, which is also a disaster, right? Pandemic is a disaster. In a way, we had this kind of how is it called? There have been some studies on the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence, because there is a critical crisis situation, the gender-based violence, cases of gender-based violence is usually increasing. Uh, Also sex trafficking and other forms of gender-related crimes. Limited access to contraception, also limited access to education, limited access to information in general. Menstrual health and hygiene, of course, is very critical, especially for those who have been displaced forcibly as a result of disaster. Mariam will talk about this, not only in the process of displacement, but also after, because most of the times, at least in the case of Georgia, the livelihood that they lost everything, right? Their houses and so on, they had nothing. And the places that they have been displaced to, the places had a lot of problems as well. Like, for example, access to water is super crucial when we talk about, for example, menstrual health and hygiene. We know that in traditional context, women are responsible to take care of households, such as, for example, washing dishes and so on. And if you don't have access to water, then how are you going to do all of this, right? Or to cook and so on. So all of these factors also greatly impact the vulnerability of women. Also, this data that I mentioned about different kind of well-known catastrophes and disasters that happened worldwide, there are so many underlying factors. For example, in some countries, the level of literacy among women is very low. So even if you have information services, if women don't have access to technologies, if women don't have access to if they are illiterate, they cannot comprehend and receive this information, right? In some cultures, it's also not common, for example, women to know how to drive or how to climb a tree, how to swim. And all of this becomes very crucial. It's life surviving skills in these crisis situations. So of course we can go as deep as we want in this discussion. I just wanted to explain the correlation, how we link gender gender stereotypes and gender inequality to climate change. And the answer to what we need basically to challenge all of this is climate justice. And climate justice, of course, begins with recognizing key groups, and there are certain challenges and vulnerabilities that we know that climate change will even increase this inequality that we have in the society. And also the fair distribution of burden and responsibilities, that sometimes people who are more affected by climate change, they also have higher burden to deal with the climate change. And that inequality we also have among countries, right? Some countries have contributed more to climate change but suffer less, while countries who have contributed the least suffer most, and their societies as well. And the participation is the key in climate change, involving all groups, involving those who can be more affected to this. And when we talk about participation, it has to be meaningful participation. Otherwise, we can have a lot of things on the papers and informal procedures. So that was it very briefly that I wanted to talk about. That's the end of my presentation. I'm not sure if there are any questions in the chat box. Let me quickly check. If you want to connect, feel free to reach out via email or on LinkedIn. Um, Otherwise, I mean, we can have few minutes for the questions, and then I will pass the floor to Mariam to present the specific case of eco-migration and the specific needs of eco-migrant women in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuki, so much for the invite, but also giving me like this overview of the theoretical background, but also describing the context that will help me a lot to deep dive into my presentation and also bring some examples. I'm really glad to be here because now I see some of the researchers are also joined, which is great, because once you do the research, then you want to speak up and show these results to other people and also try to find solutions with others. So this is my responsibility now, because I'm gonna speak about findings of my research, which is mostly about Georgia, and I will be really interested to learn from you from your countries what are the good examples and solutions about governing the disasters, and then also rehabilitation process and so on. So please feel free to put your answers and ideas in the chat. My background also has been always related to environmental and climate change issues. Specifically, I'm interested into adaptation to climate change and the resilience building, and part of my learning is always conducting these researches, that this empirical data and talking to directly to people and understanding their context is always really valuable and important for us to learn their realities. But not only in Georgia, I'm also interested in the whole South Caucasus and beyond. Now I'm going to share my presentation, which I conducted with the support of WECF Georgia, and I wanted to study what is the governance structure of eco-migration, but then I realized it's not to start learning about eco-migration, you need to understand so many contexts, what is beyond behind this process. So I tried to capture all these complexities, but now I will try my best to show this, but I'm not sure how comprehensive it will be because we have really limited time. So it's a QR code. Unfortunately, it's only available in Georgian, and now I know what will be my next task to translate it into English and publish it somewhere. But for Georgians, please feel free to read it, and I will be really happy to hear your feedback. Yeah, Anuki mentioned several times about the Korea's case, that we have excessive snow now and people, volunteers, and some of the agencies are dealing with it, and people are stuck there in remote villages for more than 5 days. And these are some pictures, like you can see. I'm sorry, there are not credits of the pictures. I downloaded it from social media, but yeah, some roofs are collapsing and people's lives are in threat. And it's interesting and really sensitive and emotional for me, because one of the case studies I conducted within this research I'm gonna speak now was Korea, and there was a landslide happened in 2023 September, and it was really strong, and so for me it's really interesting. I was thinking these days, what did the state agencies learn from this disaster, and how they are using that, if they are using that knowledge and capacity now to cope with the snow. But unfortunately, I will bring different examples, and you will see how failed the system is, unfortunately. As I mentioned, like this background and different like history and context of how eco-migration is managed is linked to the previous processes, like disaster risk reduction, then what is the emergency response, then how damage is assessed and recovery measures are undertaken, and so on. So I will try to briefly touch upon these topics and then focus on eco-migration and eco-migrant women, especially because my focus was also about women. And research questions of my relates also to this outline, what I just briefly described. And interesting thing for me was also to see where is the solution and what are the needs. So I also tried to find what could be done based on this knowledge and data I tried to gather. Briefly about methodology as well. So I conducted desk research, but also interviewed affected women, eco-migrant women. I conducted focus group discussions and interviews, but not only with eco-migrants. I tried to speak with state agencies, which had been really difficult. I need to mention it here because I only managed to talk with local governments, but not from Gurian. They did not want to speak with the others and share this information publicly. And from the central government and state and central agencies, I could not also manage to obtain any information or even conduct the interview. But I interviewed experts, CSOs, and public defender, who is one of the actors who is following and assessing the situation. And I focused on different cases and different disasters. Oh, sorry, it's in Georgian in the table here. And one of the context also is really important because in the west of Georgia and the coast, we have one slum settlement called Dream City, and I will refer to it during the presentation. And we are like, it's a slum settlement, and most of the people who live there are from high mountains whose houses have been affected by disasters, and they needed to move to the somewhere else. But this is like, and two kids died several days ago in this settlement. So for me, it was another like really emotional to read this, and that's why like we need to talk about this and discuss about solutions, and we don't have much time. About theoretical framework, it was not a theoretic academic paper, but you cannot conduct any research without having some kind of theoretical knowledge and framework in your mind. And thanks, Anuki, you mentioned intersectionality theory, which is really key, I think, for everyone, every researchers who tries to deal with different groups, especially marginalized groups. And another theoretical framework that was really useful for me and really interesting is critical institutionalism. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's really interesting because compared to traditional institutionalism, which tries to find right answers, how to manage different social issues and how to govern. Critical institutionalism tries to look at the history of how these agencies are established, what are their formation context, and how they are related to everyday social life, how they try to address poverty, and so on. So it's really a new theoretical framework that is under development process. So it was really interesting to refer to it. Now, speaking of migration, I need to mention here that in the international papers and from the other countries' experience, we see that migration is a multi-layered phenomenon, and so it's not only influenced due to the environmental factors, and there are many layers like social, political, economic, which affects and causes then migration. And this is one of the reasons actually why climate-induced migration is still like not governed properly at the international level, and there are many questions and discussions, so it's really complex. And same in Georgia, but in Georgia it's different context. So I wanted to find what are the key social and ecological structural problems that influence eco-migration in Georgia. So one of the key problem that was interesting for me to identify was systemic environmental protection issues that since there are not really strong environmental protection measures in the country and supervision and so on, this is one of the leading factor to eco-migration. So for example, in Guria, in one of the villages, locals told me that there was excessive gravel mining in the riverbed, and then when they had this heavy rain, it was easier for the river to flood the surrounding area. And same with the hydropower plants in Upper Ajara, which is which increase the precipitation and humidity. They are not unfortunately researches to prove it, but all these are really interconnected in the nature. And while we don't have these protection measures, and we have even giving environmental permits to different human activities is really easy in Georgia, which is really linked, and it is underlined in the research as well, to the economic and political agenda of the country. And it's also a complex issue in its regard. And another topic, which is also another interesting factor, is social issues. Like, for example, eco-migration is linked to the housing policy, which state doesn't have, and homelessness vision for how to deal with homelessness. And these policies are really weak in the country. And the rural development as well, because here is in the country we have huge gap between rural and urban areas, but especially from the center and periphery, like Tbilisi and other areas of the country. And this uneven development processes also affect and leads to increased eco-migration. Then systemic issues. So eco-migration doesn't start from and when the disaster happens, you need to look at this. What are the preventing measures that the country has? And in Georgia, it's also mentioned in the state documents that the country tries to proud that crisis management process in the country is centralized, and for the state it means that it could be more effective. But but for me it leads to different problems, and the experts I also listened to, they describe what kind of problems it causes, that it's centralized. And there is no unified system or methodology for data collection about crises, disasters, and so on. Anuki also mentioned this disaster risk reduction plan, which is now outdated. I've heard rumors that there is a work going on to update it, but it's not published yet. And there was an audit report which says about this, which assessed that strategy, that only a small portion, only 16% of activities which was listed in the action plan have been completed. So it's a really low number. And there is weak coordination between agencies, and there is no information exchange standards. Documents are gender neutral. And it's interesting that the responsibility for the resettlement process falls for the central agency, which is under the Ministry of Social Affairs, and to prevent measures and undertake all these preventive measures at the local level, this responsibility falls on local self-government, and these agencies have problems to coordinate with each other. And in 20 municipalities, there was another study which found that the costs of damage caused by flooding in these 2 years have been much higher than the expenses that they could invest for prevention. So mostly expenses go to damage compensation, not to prevent, which could be cheaper. And early warning systems, it's in Georgia, we repeat this many times, that the system is not really full operational, and it doesn't cover all the vulnerable areas of Georgia, and they need to be equipped with more modern devices. And these issues have been raised by local governments as well. About emergency response and managing it, now seeing it Korea, it was interesting also for me to read again this chapter in my research that this process requires proper knowledge and cooperation, and it's not easy to cope with. So you need to be prepared for this. You need plans and also knowledge how to do it. It was really heartbreaking to hear these quotes from the women when I was asking them to recall what are their experiences. This is really difficult for everyone to deal with. Like, I have a quote that one woman told me, "I have 3 children and I didn't know which one to pick up." It's really difficult. What was mentioned is it's important to decentralize decision making and rescue services, because it takes time to make decision in Tbilisi to understand what's going on at the local. And this is one of the finding from this Guria as well, because the snowing started 5 days ago and the central government started to invade in this process yesterday. So it takes time and makes it slower. Rescuers, they tried their best, and now we see also they are trying what they can, but they don't have sufficient equipment to reach all the people who need their help. And there is no helicopter, it seems, in the country. If there is, where is it? To help the people in need. And all the women emphasized that what intensified their vulnerability and fear was the disruption of communication channels, and then they feel really abandoned and alone in this process to face and deal with. Then this example of Guria from the landslide experience, I will not go into much details, but it brought many negative impacts for the people, and they explained how few hours radically changed their lives and the whole village, and then they described their village as island or locked in and without any support, even after months has passed, and they haven't received any substantial support, and the houses and auxiliary structures were damaged, their livelihoods, and also these landslides, we are still in dynamic, we are still moving, and people were still living there and looking at this, how this land is still moving and approaching them. And here, all these pictures, actually, I forgot to mention, are from Guria, from those villages. Then a green alternative, and one of the amazing photographer covered this area, Tagorovakidze. What was the important to mention here, that there was not any commission formed by the government to assess all the damage caused by this landslide, and there was also flooding. So this damage has not been assessed. Even as for now. About recovery measures, this is on the picture you see, even the roads, how they are damaged. And there was one woman, and I hear this in my ears, like I still remember this quote. There was amazing woman who told me, who recalled this process, that she said, I was walking with 3 children. She's widow woman, looking for a house to rent or to buy. I remember it very vividly, like stray dogs in the streets searching for food. That's what I was reminded of at that time. So she felt like left alone, and when they needed some kind of shelter and house, the state tried to, they counted more than 800 people, households that needed to be resettled, but this woman, for example, was not among these numbers. So the number was really high. And actually now seeing this snow there, I think like that's good that they managed to resettle that amount of people. Otherwise we would have more people in danger now in Guria, because most of the houses who are collapsed now are those ones who where people families have been resettled from. And then municipalities, what they do, local municipalities, they don't collect gender disaggregated data. When I asked them this question, if they counted, they found this question awkward. That some of them didn't realize why they need to collect this information separately on women and men. Yeah, and even if they support these families to rent their flats, they don't know how many men and women are there and how many women and men they support. And rehabilitation measures, like there was one woman who said, like, I beg local government to bring a tractor and machines to clean the way, but I don't hear a word from anyone. And it's also important to emphasize that these villages mostly are remote villages now, because mostly old people live there, and women with their kids, because men are in immigration, and so this responsibility falls on women and old people to take care of the families and their safety. Eco-migration management process. Sorry, just I want to check the time. Okay. I will try to be faster. So the status of eco-migrants does not align with the definition of IDPs as defined by the Georgian law, nor with the international standards. So eco-migrants are not recognized as the people who have been resettled due to different factors. So according to the law. And therefore, they still cannot benefit from the legal protection mechanisms guaranteed by law for internally displaced people. And there is no uniform assistance system for these families. Since there is not any legislation that could regulate this process, then these decisions made differ from each other, and it leaves a space for the country to take ad hoc measures and choose which kind of supportive measure they want to undertake. And there is neither a state strategy nor an action plan to govern these issues, I mean, related to eco-migration. Yeah, and what else can be said there? Yeah, also local municipalities are not informed when central government, like the ministry, takes decision, and this respective agency, which families need to be resettled, they send the money to the family, and local governments, they are not informed which families are resettled, to monitor this process and support these families if they need. Or also, like they mentioned, like after the disasters, they found that there were some families who received this funding from the government, so they were not supposed to live in these houses, but people still live, because living their houses is not easy, and the money which they receive is not really enough for these families to find new decent houses. Lack of support and social protection for eco-migrants, like it has been always tricky in Georgia because in the past it has been used to strengthen nationalism and dominance over ethnic minorities, and it's also another topic to discuss, so I will not go into the details. So this is the history and background of the eco-migrants in Georgia that also maybe affects today's reality that it's not still ungoverned. And majority of eco-migrants must still live in below poverty line. Those ones who have been resettled in many years ago, they still live in poverty. These houses, lands are not registered under their name, so which means they don't receive any kind of different support from, could it be government or any other organizations. And it's an interesting quote from the public defender that, for example, in 2023, only 376 families were provided with housing. Including those ones who requested that houses from 2016. And according to public defender, they said that even 6 years is not enough to make a decision on resettlement. So it's really lengthy process for the agencies to decide which families need to be resettled. And public defender states that this is an unreasonably long time, especially under conditions where the families concerned are affected by a disaster. So during these 6 years, are they supposed to live in this under the disaster? Or then also local governments play their role to support by paying their rent for the houses, but it's also really another complicated topic. Integration measures are also really important that the country needs to implement, but this is not happening, unfortunately, or it's really weak. And local government representative told me that some of the people leave their houses before they receive geologist conclusion, which is the basics for a green light that this family needs to be resettled. But before they receive it, some people already start to leave, and those ones are the families who can afford it. But to emphasize, I'm trying to emphasize that how painful this resettlement process for some families could be. That one of the local government representative told me that they have a person in their municipality who said to leave him. And he said, I will be careful and allow me, please allow me to live in my house and let me die here. So yeah, it's not easy process for not only for the state, but also these houses to live their villages. And especially for women, and I will refer. I have another example of Yahuluja. This has been an interesting case for me because these people are eco-migrants, but also IDPs from Trinwale, which is occupied by Russia now. So these people were affected by earthquake, and we are moved to the south part of Georgia. And then war happened. So in 2008, so these people could not manage to go back, and now they have official status of IDPs, not eco-migrants. And they used to live in this, you can see in the first picture, in these houses. So more than 30 families lived there without like proper basic services and livelihoods. And then they received these new houses with the support of German government or Austrian, if I can't recall correctly. So they were so happy that they achieved it, but this process was really difficult, and they were fighting so hard to reach this. And there have been so many threats, they explained that how state tried to get them silenced, not to protest that much, but women explained me how they fought for this, and it was really interesting for me to learn this. Okay, I will try to conclude soon, but before I want to mention the political nature of state assistance and women's activism that has been a key in all these cases I explored. Women, like on the one hand, they bear all these burdens and that they live in due to the impacts of the disasters, but on the other hand, how they try to speak up and fight for their houses and for their family's well-being. Yeah, and here I have different examples from different places how women try to mobilize and protest, including these minings. Women also try to speak up against this kind of minings and try to protect their village. As a conclusion, I can say that the state has not developed policy documents, laws, or any methodologies for the prevention and management of eco-migration yet, and the resources scarcity is used as a justification of their inaction for preventing disaster risks and also in avoiding assistance to the affected population. And the state's approach towards eco-migration change according to the political context, and they are not consistent. And the transparency and adopting fair approaches is always problematic. And it's not a coincidence that every experience shared by respondent women regarding disasters is told by women living in the periphery of the country who lack access to many public goods and political participation. In the research revealed that the women in local communities bear responsibility and pressure at all levels of disaster risk prevention and then management. This is really interesting finding. I think that as a result of women's activism, the visibility of eco-migrants problem has increased recently, but unfortunately, it's not still sufficiently visible. But they are on the front lines, the women of all this process. Now I will finish here. Sorry, it took me long, but there are many things to be told. And please, if you have any questions, let me know. I'm ready to address. Thank you.